There was a time when Darnell Osei believed some doors were meant to stay closed forever. But what happened on Family Feud that afternoon would test that belief in front of 400 strangers. When Steve Harvey made one final quiet request, nobody in that studio knew whether Darnell would walk toward his father or walk away for good. Darnell Osei was 38 years old. For 22 years, he had built his entire adult identity around a single unwavering decision: he would never speak to his father again. Not for any reason, not under any circumstances. Darnell grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the only son of a Ghanaian immigrant father, Kwame, and an American mother, Sherry, who divorced when Darnell was 11. The divorce itself wasn't the wound that shaped Darnell's life. What shaped him was what came after: Kwame's slow, deliberate withdrawal from his son's life over the following 5 years, a withdrawal that Darnell experienced not as a single traumatic event, but as 1,000 small absences accumulating into something unbearable. His father missed his 6th grade graduation, citing a work conflict Darnell later learned wasn't true. He missed 2 consecutive birthdays. He promised, more times than Darnell could count, to take him to Ghana someday to meet his grandparents and cousins, a trip that never materialized. By the time Darnell turned 16, Kwame had started a new family in Atlanta with a woman Darnell had never met, and the calls, already infrequent, stopped almost entirely. The final conversation between them happened when Darnell was 16 years old, a phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes. Kwame called to inform Darnell that he and his new wife were expecting a baby. Delivering the news with what Darnell remembered as an almost businesslike detachment, no acknowledgement of how the news might land on a teenage son who had spent years watching his father slowly disappear from his life. Darnell, in a fit of adolescent rage and heartbreak he had never fully processed even as an adult, told his father he never wanted to hear from him again, and hung up the phone. Kwame, to Darnell's lasting and complicated bitterness, actually honored that request completely, never calling again, never reaching out on birthdays, never attempting reconciliation even once in the following 22 years. Darnell's mother, Sherry, raised him alone from that point forward, working 2 jobs to keep their household afloat. And Darnell channeled much of his adolescent anger into academic achievement, eventually earning a scholarship to Ohio State and building a successful career as a mechanical engineer. He married his college sweetheart, Amara, and they had 2 children together, a boy and a girl, now 12 and 9 years old. Sherry, watching her son grow into adulthood, often worried privately about the anger he carried, though she rarely voiced these concerns directly, uncertain whether raising the subject would help or simply reopen wounds better left alone. She had her own complicated feelings about Kwame's absence from Darnell's life, relief in some ways, that she no longer had to manage the disappointment of a father who never quite followed through on his promises, but also genuine sadness for her son, who she knew carried a father-shaped hole in his life regardless of how successful and stable his adult years appeared from the outside. Darnell's academic achievements during high school and college became, in retrospect, something of a coping mechanism, a way of proving to himself and to the world that he did not need his father's presence or approval to build a meaningful life. He threw himself into his studies with an intensity that impressed his teachers and worried his mother in equal measure. Graduating at the top of his high school class and earning a full engineering scholarship that allowed him to attend Ohio State without the financial burden that had weighed so heavily on Sherry throughout his childhood. At Ohio State, Darnell met Amara during his sophomore year, in an introductory chemistry course they were both struggling through. Amara, unlike most people Darnell dated in college, never pushed him to open up about his family history before he was ready, sensing early on that this was territory he guarded carefully. It took nearly 2 years of dating before Darnell told her the full story of his father's slow withdrawal and the final phone call at 16, and even then, he told it with a practiced detachment, as though narrating events that had happened to someone else entirely. Darnell had built, by every outward measure, an admirable and stable life. But he carried, underneath that stability, a persistent and unexamined rage toward his father that had calcified over 2 decades into something closer to identity than emotion. He refused to speak his father's name in his own household. He told his children, when they were old enough to ask, that their grandfather on his side simply wasn't part of their lives, offering no further explanation and discouraging further questions. Amara, over the years of their marriage, had gently pushed him more than once to consider some form of reconciliation, at least enough to give his own children the chance to know their paternal grandfather. But Darnell had always shut the conversation down quickly and firmly, treating the subject as entirely closed for discussion. His children, particularly his older son, had begun asking more pointed questions in recent years as they grew old enough to notice that their friends' family structures included grandparents on both sides, while their own family tree seemed to have an unexplained gap on their father's side. Darnell had developed a practiced, brief response to these questions over the years. "Grandpa Kwame isn't part of our lives, and that's just how it is," that effectively shut down further inquiry without ever satisfying his children's natural curiosity about the missing piece of their family history. "Some people don't deserve a second chance," he would tell Amara whenever the topic arose. He had 22 years to reach out. He chose not to. That's his choice, and I've made my own choice in response, and I don't see any reason to revisit either one. Darnell's cousin, a woman named Yolanda who had remained close with both sides of the extended family despite the estrangement between Darnell and his father, was the one who convinced Darnell to apply for Family Feud, framing it as a fun family outing for Darnell, Amara, and their 2 children to enjoy together. Darnell agreed readily, seeing it as exactly the kind of light-hearted family activity he valued, entirely disconnected from the painful history he had spent 2 decades trying to keep sealed away. What Darnell did not know, and what Yolanda herself had not fully considered when suggesting the outing, was that his father, Kwame, had spent the past several years attempting, quietly and without Darnell's knowledge, to find some way back into his son's life. Kwame's second marriage had ended in divorce 5 years earlier, and the loss of that relationship, combined with his own advancing age and a health scare involving his heart 2 years prior, had brought him to a profound and painful reckoning with the choices he had made as a younger man. He had written Darnell several letters over the preceding 3 years, none of which he ever worked up the courage to actually send, all of them sitting in a drawer in his Atlanta apartment, unfinished apologies he couldn't bring himself to complete. Kwame had reached out to Yolanda directly about 8 months before the taping, in a moment of desperate vulnerability, asking if she thought there was any possible way to reach his son after so many years of silence. Yolanda, torn between loyalty to her cousin and compassion for a man she had also known and cared about her whole life, had not initially known what to do with this request. When the Family Feud application came together for Darnell's family months later, Yolanda saw, for better or worse, an opportunity, and quietly, without informing Darnell, reached out to the show's producers herself, explaining the full situation and asking if there was any appropriate way to facilitate a potential reconciliation, entirely contingent on Darnell's own willingness once the moment arrived. Yolanda had wrestled considerably with the ethics of this decision in the months leading up to the taping. She had grown up close to both sides of the family, having spent considerable time with Kwame during her own childhood before his relationship with Darnell deteriorated, and she carried a complicated fondness for him that coexisted uneasily alongside her loyalty to her cousin's pain. She remembered Kwame from her own childhood as a warm, if imperfect, presence at family gatherings. Someone who told entertaining stories about growing up in Accra and who always seemed genuinely delighted by his young relatives, which made his later withdrawal from Darnell's life all the more confusing and painful for everyone who had known him before that withdrawal began. When Kwame first called her 8 months before the taping, his voice had been shaky and uncertain in a way Yolanda had never heard from him before. He explained about his heart scare 2 years earlier, about the divorce from his second wife that had left him more alone than he had been in decades, about the letters he had written to Darnell and never sent, sitting in a drawer collecting dust because he could never quite convince himself the words were adequate to the damage he had caused. "I don't know what I'm asking you for," Kwame had told her during that first call. "I don't even know if I deserve to ask anything of anyone at this point. I just don't want to die without at least trying." Yolanda had sat with that request for weeks before deciding what, if anything, to do about it. She ultimately concluded that whatever happened between Darnell and his father was not hers to force. but that she also could not, in good conscience, sit on information that might matter enormously to both men if handled carefully and with genuine respect for Darnell's autonomy in the situation. When the family feud opportunity arose for Darnell's family, she saw a controlled, semi-public setting where reconciliation might at least be offered as a possibility, without forcing anything on anyone who wasn't ready. During the pre-show interview process, a producer named Michael sat down with Darnell and asked, as he asked every contestant, about interesting aspects of his family background for the segment. Darnell, unaware of Yolanda's outreach, spoke openly and without hesitation about his estrangement from his father, framing it clearly and firmly as a closed chapter of his life that he had no interest in revisiting. "My father made his choice 22 years ago," Darnell told Michael. "I've built a good life without him. I don't carry any confusion about that decision. It's settled." Michael, already aware of Kwame's outreach to Yolanda from earlier conversations with the research department, listened carefully but did not push the subject, recognizing the delicate nature of what the show was now considering. He simply thanked Darnell for sharing and moved on to lighter questions about the game itself, though internally, he flagged the conversation for further discussion with the show's producers and research team. Aware that they were now facing a genuinely delicate ethical question about how, or whether, to proceed with facilitating any kind of reunion that Darnell himself had not requested or anticipated. The production team debated this question extensively in the days leading up to the taping, ultimately deciding that they would proceed cautiously, giving Darnell complete and repeated agency over whether any reconciliation occurred, rather than surprising him in a way that pressured him toward an outcome he hadn't chosen. This careful approach would prove essential to how the segment ultimately unfolded. The day of the taping arrived, and Darnell's team, himself, Amara, Yolanda, and one of Darnell's college friends, moved through the early rounds with easy, comfortable energy, Darnell in particularly good spirits, enjoying watching his own children in the audience laughing and cheering for their parents. Yolanda, for her part, felt a persistent undercurrent of nervous tension throughout the early rounds, aware of what was potentially coming, and uncertain how her cousin would react once the truth of her involvement came to light. Then, during a break between rounds, Steve Harvey approached Darnell's chair personally, his expression noticeably more serious than the playful energy he'd maintained throughout the earlier rounds. He knelt down beside Darnell, speaking quietly enough that only Darnell could hear him. "Darnell, I need a few minutes of your trust here. Can you give me that?" Darnell felt an unfamiliar unease settle over him, though he had no way of anticipating what was about to unfold. He nodded, cautious but curious. The cameras rolled again, and the studio's energy shifted noticeably, the playful atmosphere replaced by something far more solemn. "Darnell," Steve said, his voice measured and deliberate, "in your pre-show interview, you shared something about your relationship with your father. Our team followed up on that conversation this week, and something has developed that I think you need to know about before we continue." Darnell's jaw tightened immediately. "With respect, Mr. Harvey," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I don't think there's anything to develop. That relationship ended a long time ago, by my own choice, and I'm at peace with that." Steve nodded, acknowledging the boundary Darnell was setting. "I hear you, and I want to respect that," he said. "But I need to tell you something first, and then the rest of this is entirely your choice, no pressure from me or from this show. Your father has been trying to find a way back into your life for years. He's written you letters he never sent, and Darnell, he's here today." The studio had gone almost completely silent, 400 people sensing they were witnessing something far more delicate and complicated than the show's usual emotional reveals. Darnell's face had gone rigid, a mixture of shock and old familiar anger crossing his features in quick succession. "He's here," Darnell repeated flatly, not a question so much as an attempt to process the words. "He reached out to your cousin Yolanda several months ago," Steve explained carefully. "He's been struggling with real regret over the choices he made when you were younger. He had a health scare a couple years back that made him take stock of his life. And reaching you became something he couldn't stop thinking about, even though he had no idea how or if he should even try, after so many years of silence he himself had honored at your request." Darnell's hands had curled into fists on the armrests of his chair. "He honored my request for 22 years, Darnell said, his voice tight. Now, suddenly, he wants back in? Because he got sick? Because he's lonely after his second marriage ended? That's not regret, Mr. Harvey, that's convenience." Steve nodded slowly, not rushing to argue the point. "I understand that reaction completely," he said. "And I want to be very clear with you. Nobody in this building is going to force you to do anything you don't want to do today. If you tell me right now that you want him removed from the building, that will happen immediately. No questions asked, no further discussion. This is entirely your call." Darnell, Amara, sitting beside her husband, reached over and took his hand, saying nothing, simply offering her steady presence. Darnell sat in silence for a long, agonizing moment, the studio holding its breath around him. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter now, some of the sharp anger giving way to something more complicated. "What does he want to say? Do you know?" "I don't know the specifics," Steve admitted honestly. "I only know that he asked for the chance to say it to your face, whatever it turns out to be, and that he told our team he would understand completely if you refused." Darnell looked out at his two children in the audience, both of them watching their father with wide, uncertain eyes, sensing something significant was happening even if they didn't fully understand it. He thought about the conversations he'd shut down with Amara over the years, the firm wall he'd built around this particular subject in his own household. He thought too about the letters Steve had mentioned, letters his father had apparently written but never sent, and felt a strange, unwelcome curiosity stirring beneath his anger. "I don't want to see him," Darnell finally said, his voice firmer now. "I appreciate you telling me, Mr. Harvey, but I'd like to move on with the game if that's all right." Steve nodded immediately, without any hint of pushback. "Of course," he said. "That's entirely your right, and I respect it completely. We'll move forward exactly as you've asked." The game resumed for a short while, though the energy in the studio remained subdued, everyone aware that something significant had been left unresolved just beneath the surface. Darnell answered the next round's questions on autopilot, his mind clearly elsewhere, his usual easy humor replaced by a distracted tension he couldn't quite shake. During the following commercial break, Steve approached Darnell's chair one final time, this time simply crouching beside him quietly, without cameras rolling yet, speaking to him as one man to another rather than as a host managing a segment. "Darnell, I'm not going to push you," Steve said quietly. "I meant what I said. This is entirely your choice, and I'll respect whatever you decide, on camera or off. But I want to ask you one thing, and then I'll leave it alone for good, whatever you answer." Darnell looked at him warily. "What is it?" 22 years from now," Steve said, "when your own children are grown, and they're the ones deciding whether to reach out to you after some falling out neither of you can quite remember starting, what would you want them to do? Would you want them to have the door slammed shut for good? Or would you want them to at least hear you out, even if it changed nothing in the end?" Darnell said nothing for a long moment, the question landing somewhere deep and uncomfortable. He looked again at his two children in the audience, then at Amara beside him, who squeezed his hand gently without saying a word, leaving the decision entirely his to make. "I'm not agreeing to forgive him," Darnell finally said, his voice low. "I want that understood clearly. But I'll hear what he has to say. Just this once. Bring him out." Steve nodded, his own eyes glistening slightly, and gave a small signal toward the production booth. The cameras rolled again, and the curtain at the side of the stage parted slowly. Kwame stepped through, considerably older than the photographs Darnell remembered from childhood, his hair now fully gray. Moving with the careful gait of a man whose heart had failed him once already, and who walked now with the awareness of his own fragility. He stopped several feet from Darnell's chair, his hands trembling visibly at his sides. "Darnell," Kwame said, his voice thick with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know 22 years of silence doesn't get undone by one conversation on a stage in front of strangers. I only ask that you let me say the things I should have said years ago, whatever you decide to do with them afterward." Darnell stood slowly, his jaw tight, his posture rigid, every instinct in his body still braced for disappointment. "Say it then," he said. I was a coward, Kwame said simply. Not the kind of coward who runs from danger. The kind who runs from his own shame. Every missed birthday, every broken promise about Ghana, every excuse I gave your mother, those weren't about work, or timing, or bad luck. They were about a man who didn't know how to face the fact that he was failing at the one thing that mattered most, being a father to his son. It was easier to disappear slowly than to face that failure directly. And when you told me, at 16, that you never wanted to hear from me again, some cowardly part of me felt relief. Because it meant I no longer had to face what I already knew about myself. I told myself I was respecting your wishes. The truth is I was hiding behind them. Darnell's eyes had filled with tears he refused to let fall, his hands clenched at his sides. 22 years, he said. 2 children who don't know their own grandfather. A wife who's asked me for years to at least try, and I always said no, because I was so sure you didn't deserve it. You were right not to be sure of anything good about me, Kwame said. I don't deserve automatic forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it today. I'm only asking for the chance, however small, to start proving over whatever years I have left, that the man who disappeared isn't the only man I'm capable of being. I had a health scare 2 years ago that nearly took me before I ever got the chance to say any of this. I don't want to run out of time again. What happened with your heart? Darnell asked, the question surprising even himself, a flicker of something other than pure anger crossing his expression for the first time since Kwame had stepped through the curtain. A blockage the doctors caught almost too late, Kwame said. I was alone in my apartment when it happened. I called an ambulance myself, barely able to speak clearly by the time they arrived. I remember lying on that gurney thinking, if this is it, if this is how it ends. The last conversation I ever had with my son was the one where he told me never to call again, and I never even tried to change that. That thought scared me more than the blockage itself did. Darnell was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Why didn't you try sooner then? If the health scare happened 2 years ago, why now? Why here? Why like this? Cowardice again, Kwame admitted. I wrote letters, 3 of them, over 3 years. I never sent a single one, because every time I finished writing, I read it back and it felt inadequate. Felt like words on a page couldn't possibly carry the weight of what I owed you. I told myself I needed to find the perfect words before I could reach out. The truth is I was afraid of your answer, afraid that if I finally tried and you rejected me anyway, I would have to accept that the door really was closed forever, with no more excuses left to hide behind. As long as I hadn't tried, I could still tell myself reconciliation was possible someday. Trying and failing felt like it would take that last small hope away from me entirely. Darnell absorbed this in silence, the studio around them holding its breath collectively. So Yolanda reaching out to this show, that wasn't your idea? No, Kwame said. I told her about my regret, about the letters. In a moment of weakness I hadn't planned on sharing with anyone. I didn't ask her to do this. When she called me 2 weeks ago and told me what she'd arranged, I almost said no. I was terrified of confronting you like this, in front of strangers, with cameras rolling. But I was more terrified of the alternative, of continuing to let cowardice win. The same cowardice that had already cost us 22 years. Steve, who had been standing quietly to the side allowing the moment to unfold naturally, finally spoke again, his voice still thick with emotion. Mrs. Simmons, I have to ask, he began, catching himself. Mr. Osei, forgive me. Darnell, in 22 years, did you ever come close to reaching out yourself? Was there ever a moment where you almost broke your own silence? Darnell considered the question carefully. Once he admitted, when my daughter was born, 9 years ago, holding her for the first time, I thought about calling him, thought about giving her the chance to know at least one more grandparent. I got as far as finding his old number in an email from years back. I never dialed it. I told myself he'd had every opportunity to reach out first, that it wasn't my responsibility to make the first move after everything he'd put me through. I still believe that, honestly, but I also recognize now that belief kept a door shut that maybe didn't need to stay shut quite so completely. Steve, visibly moved by this admission, placed a gentle hand on Darnell's shoulder. Sometimes, he said quietly, It takes exactly this, an unexpected moment, a public stage, a final request from someone else entirely, to finally open a door that both people were too afraid, or too proud, or too hurt, to open on their own. I don't think that makes the truth any less real, or the courage it takes any less real, for finally coming out today. Darnell did not embrace his father on that stage. He did not offer forgiveness in the dramatic, immediate way television moments sometimes suggest such reconciliations should unfold. Instead, he stood in silence for a long moment, studying the older, diminished version of the man who had once loomed so large and so painfully in his memory, and finally said, "I'm not ready to call you Dad again. I don't know if I ever will be, but I'll give you my phone number. If you call, I'll answer. That's all I can offer today." Kwame nodded, tears streaming freely down his face, clearly understanding this offer for exactly what it was, not reconciliation but the barest possible opening of a door that had been sealed shut for 22 years. "That's more than I came here hoping for," he said. "Thank you." Production quietly ended the segment there, giving Darnell and his father space backstage to exchange contact information and speak further away from the cameras, though neither of them chose to extend that initial conversation very long. Darnell later admitted that he needed considerable time and distance to process what had happened before he felt ready for anything more substantial. The weeks following the taping were, by Darnell's own account, some of the most emotionally turbulent of his adult life. He found himself replaying the encounter constantly, second-guessing the decision to hear his father out at all, then second-guessing the decision to offer even that small opening, then feeling guilty for his own hesitation. A churning cycle of emotion he hadn't experienced since his teenage years, when his father's absence was still a fresh and constant wound rather than an old calcified scar. Amara proved to be his steadiest anchor throughout this period, careful never to push him toward reconciliation faster than he was ready to move, but consistently present and supportive as he worked through 2 decades of unexamined anger. "I'm not asking you to forgive him on any particular timeline," she told him during one difficult evening several weeks after the taping. "I'm just glad you finally heard him, instead of carrying this alone for the rest of our lives together." Kwame called exactly once in the first month after the taping, a brief, careful conversation lasting perhaps 10 minutes, both men clearly uncertain how to navigate the unfamiliar territory of speaking to one another after 22 years of silence. The conversation was stilted, full of long pauses, neither man quite finding the words for a relationship that had no established shape or rhythm to fall back on. But it was, undeniably, a beginning, however awkward and uncertain. Over the following year, the calls grew slightly more frequent, though never especially warm or easy. Darnell remained guarded throughout, careful not to let hope outpace his own hard-won caution, having been disappointed by this particular man too many times in his childhood to extend trust freely now. Kwame, for his part, never pushed for more than Darnell was willing to give, seemingly aware that he had forfeited any right to expect quick forgiveness and content, for now, simply to exist again in some small capacity in his son's life. In the 2 years since the original taping, the story of Darnell and Kwame's tentative reconciliation has continued to unfold in small, deliberate increments, each one carefully negotiated between 2 men who both understood, in their own ways, how easily the fragile progress could unravel if pushed too quickly. Darnell's mother, Sherry, learned of the reconciliation attempt only after the episode aired, Darnell having chosen not to inform her beforehand, uncertain how she might react given her own complicated history with Kwame. Sherry's reaction, when she finally watched the segment, surprised Darnell considerably, rather than the anger or protective instinct he had half expected. She responded with a quiet, measured relief. "I always worried that anger would calcify into something you couldn't put down even if you wanted to," she told her son. "I'm not telling you to forgive him. I'm just glad you got the chance to decide for yourself, rather than carrying a decision you made at 16 for the rest of your life, without ever revisiting it as the grown man you've become." Sherry herself declined, at least initially, to have any direct contact with Kwame following the reconciliation, telling Darnell she had made her own peace with that chapter of her life decades earlier and saw no need to reopen it now. She did, however, encourage her grandchildren's budding relationship with their paternal grandfather. Recognizing that whatever history existed between the adults in the situation, the children deserved the chance to form their own independent relationships, unburdened by decades of accumulated resentment that belonged to a previous generation. Darnell's engineering colleagues, several of whom had watched the episode after learning about his television appearance, approached the aftermath with a mixture of curiosity and respect, several of them privately sharing their own complicated family estrangements with Darnell in the weeks following the broadcast, apparently finding in his story permission to discuss struggles they had rarely voiced openly at work. One colleague, a woman named Patricia who had not spoken to her own mother in nearly a decade, told Darnell that watching his hesitation, his refusal to rush toward easy forgiveness, had given her a framework for thinking about her own estrangement that felt more honest than the simple reconciliation narratives she usually encountered. "You didn't pretend it was simple," she told him. "That helped me more than a story where everyone just hugs and cries, and everything's fixed." The relationship between Darnell and Kwame continued its careful, incremental progress over the following months. Kwame, for his part, never pushed for more contact or intimacy than Darnell offered, having apparently internalized, perhaps for the first time in his life, the importance of respecting boundaries he had once been so careless about honoring. He sent occasional texts rather than calling, understanding intuitively that this lower-pressure form of communication gave Darnell more control over the pace and timing of their exchanges. He never brought up the missed birthdays or broken promises from Darnell's childhood, waiting instead for his son to raise those topics if and when he felt ready. About 10 months after the original taping, Darnell finally raised the subject of Ghana directly with his father for the first time since childhood, the trip Kwame had promised so many times and never delivered, to meet grandparents and cousins Darnell had still never met even in his late 30s. "I used to dream about that trip," Darnell told his father during one of their now regular phone calls. "I used to imagine what it would be like to meet everyone, to see where you grew up. I gave up on that dream a long time ago, but I still think about it sometimes." Kwame, moved nearly to tears by his son finally broaching this particular old wound directly, offered, tentatively, to help arrange such a trip now. "Decades late, but perhaps not entirely too late. Your grandmother is still alive," Kwame told him. "She's 83 now, and she asks about you every time we speak. She never stopped hoping she might meet you someday." Darnell did not commit to the trip immediately, needing time to consider what such a significant step might mean for his own healing process. But he did not reject the idea outright either, telling his father simply that he would think about it seriously, a response that Kwame received with visible gratitude, understanding it as real progress rather than another closed door. The larger, more complicated question of whether Darnell's children would ever meet their paternal grandfather remained unresolved for well over a year after the reunion. Darnell wrestled with this decision more than almost any other aspect of the reconciliation, protective of his own children in a way that echoed uncomfortably his own childhood experience of a father who had proven unreliable. "I don't want them to build a relationship with him only to have him disappear again," Darnell told Amara during one of many long conversations about the subject. "I survived that disappearance because I was old enough to eventually process it. I don't know if I could watch my own children go through the same thing." Eventually, roughly 14 months after the original taping, Darnell agreed to a single, carefully arranged visit, Kwame traveling to Columbus to meet his grandchildren for the first time, in a controlled low-pressure setting at a local park rather than in the family home, which Darnell still wasn't ready to open to his father. The visit was brief and cautious, but ultimately positive. Darnell's children curious and eventually warm toward the grandfather they had heard almost nothing about for their entire lives. Darnell watched from a careful distance throughout the visit, still guarded, still uncertain, but undeniably moved by watching his own children extend a warmth and openness toward his father that he himself was not yet able to fully offer. Darnell's daughter, the younger of his two children at 9 years old, took to her grandfather with an ease that surprised everyone present, asking him a stream of curious questions about Ghana, about his childhood, about the foods he ate growing up. Questions Kwame answered with visible delight, clearly savoring the opportunity to share this piece of himself with a grandchild after so many years of having no outlet for these particular stories. Darnell's son, the older of the two at 12, was more reserved initially, watching the interaction between his sister and grandfather with a careful, evaluating distance that Darnell recognized, with some discomfort, as an echo of his own guardedness. "I'm not there yet," Darnell said afterward, reflecting on the visit. "I don't know if I'll ever fully get there. But watching my kids with him today, I understood something I hadn't let myself consider before, that they deserve the chance to form their own relationship with him, separate from my own history and my own wounds. I can't protect them from every possible disappointment life might bring. I can only make sure they have the chance to find out for themselves who he is now, rather than only inheriting my old anger about who he used to be." Yolanda, who had taken the considerable risk of reaching out to the show's producers without Darnell's knowledge, admitted afterward that she had worried for months about whether she had overstepped, potentially damaging her relationship with her cousin by facilitating a confrontation he hadn't asked for. "I still don't know if what I did was entirely right," she said. "I know Darnell was upset with me initially, once he learned I was the one who set the whole thing in motion, but he's since told me he's grateful, even if the road since then has been harder than either of us expected. I think sometimes the people who love us have to take a risk on our behalf, even when we might not choose that risk for ourselves in the moment." Darnell did eventually forgive Yolanda for her role in orchestrating the encounter, though it took several months of somewhat strained interactions between the cousins before Darnell fully processed his complicated feelings about being confronted with his father's presence without any advance warning. "I understand why she did it," he said eventually. "I don't know if I would have agreed if she'd asked me directly beforehand, and I think she knew that too. I'm not sure I can say she was right to go around me the way she did, but I also can't say the outcome wasn't ultimately valuable, even if the method still sits uneasily with me." Darnell and Kwame's relationship, roughly 2 years after the reunion, remains a careful, ongoing work in progress, rather than any kind of fully resolved happy ending. They speak perhaps twice a month. Kwame has visited Columbus 3 additional times to see his grandchildren, and Darnell has, on 2 occasions, allowed his father into the family home directly rather than only meeting in neutral public settings. But Darnell is careful, in every interview or conversation about the reconciliation since, never to overstate where things currently stand. "People want a clean story," Darnell said in a follow-up conversation roughly 18 months after the original taping. "They want me to say I've fully forgiven him, that we're father and son again exactly the way it should have always been. I can't honestly say that. What I can say is that I stopped carrying the entire weight of that anger alone, all the time, in every part of my life. I gave my kids the chance to know a grandfather I'd have otherwise erased from their lives completely, and I gave myself, finally, the chance to see my father as an actual flawed, aging, regretful human being, rather than only as the villain of my own childhood story. That's not full forgiveness, but it's more peace than I had for 22 years, and for now that peace is enough." Steve Harvey, reflecting on the segment during a later anniversary retrospective the show produced, offered his own closing thought on Darnell's story specifically. "Not every door that opens leads somewhere perfect," he said. "But a door that stays completely shut forever guarantees nothing gets to grow on the other side of it, ever." Darnell taught all of us watching that day that sometimes courage doesn't look like forgiveness. Sometimes it just looks like agreeing to listen, one time, and letting whatever grows from that conversation grow slowly, honestly, and entirely on its own terms.